Thanks, Jim, and just thanks for inviting me to the conference. So I don't get a chance to say that to you later. It's been magnificent. I'll try not to have a lengthy dissertation, but I do want to lead in a little bit, seizing upon a thread that was posed by our Treasury Board analyst, our Treasury Board representative yesterday, related to how we interact in Ottawa with the different levels of government to make defense procurement work. And I think the answer to his question really was more along the lines of what Admiral Murdoch was saying yesterday in terms of it's not ill will or mistrust really between the different levels of government departments. It's really capacity that is the challenge in Ottawa these days. It's probably always been like that. And so when we get an opportunity to go forward with Treasury Board with a particular project, I kind of regard it as having a date at the prom. We want to show up well-dressed and in a tidy manner and put our best foot forward. So I completely understand how they want the package to completely describe whatever project we're bringing forward, and including the through-life aspects of it. So I'll use CSC as an example of how challenging that can be. If you think of that major Crown program, we anticipate it'll start building ships in 2020-ish, deliver operational capability to the fleet 2025 timeframe. And if we deliver one ship every 18 months-ish after that, it could be into the 2040s before we're complete with that program. And so when you think about the technology challenges, like Moore's Law, for example, computer, if I get it correct, I'm not sure, the computer technology doubling in capability in every couple of years or so, you can see how if you're building ships over 20 years, that you do need to make changes along the way, or have to contemplate what the impact of not making changes will be technologically in that program, or else you're not going to be building relevant ships at the end of the program, right? So I understand the perspective of Treasury Board with respect to we need you to predict what a barrel of oil is going to cost in 2070 as part of the through life challenge for any program, but it's also a challenge for us, and we're not looking for a novel or unique way of skirting government process. It's just a function of looking at how we get the technology to be relevant over the long term. Now, sorry about the dissertation. I'll move on to the question. My question is related to the character of the navies that you're going to see a raid around the world and off the coast in the Pacific Rim in 20 years from now, right? So I'll give you an example. When I was a sub-lieutenant in Halifax, cell phones didn't exist, right? In the early 80s, or middle 80s, late 80s, when the Halifax class was being designed, and then when it was fielded in the 90s, and nor did UAVs. And now everybody has a cell phone, which is effectively a portable C2 system of their own. And UAVs have changed the character of how we deploy with ships that were not envisioned when the Halifax class was built. That's 20 years into the life of that vessel, and it'll probably go for another 20 years before we're done. And so I'm interested in projecting forward what your thoughts of the character of the fleets of the future will be that will be operating in that area. When I think of things like ballistic missile, anti-ship ballistic missiles, long-range ballistic missiles that can hit land targets from other coastal areas. And so will that change the character of the ships that are deployed in that area? Will they require strike capability to be built into those ships or not? Will it change the nature of how we deploy our own ships? Should Canada be looking at ballistic missile defense capabilities in CSC so that we can defend our own cities from threats that develop 20 years from now from coastal states that don't have navies but can build long-range ballistic missiles to strike targets in Canada or elsewhere? And so does that change the character of the type of the navies we'll see deployed in those areas? So will we have our most impactful kinetic vessels defending our own territories? And will we deploy vessels that are more or less patrol vessels or less, I know it was referred to earlier that the punch of the U.S. Carrier Strike Group, but will it always be like that? Or will, technology we're seeing emerging, long-range torpedoes that can travel 200 kilometers, be wire-guided, change the way coastal states defend themselves? So there's some food for thought there. I'm curious what your thoughts are on what the character of the fleets in 20 years will look like and what we should be building now to do that.
Thank you. Rowan, would like to field that one?
Clearly Jim thinks my crystal ball is better than his and yours, and it isn't. And none of us has a crystal ball that's any good, really. But what we do have is some experiences in programs that suggest to us there are some perhaps basic things that we should do to make sure that whatever comes along in 20 years, we're reasonably placed to deal with that. So what do I mean by that? You know, we used to have, and it fell into some serious level of disrepute in use in Australia, but it was a phrase that said, steel is cheap and air is free. So make the ships big enough for growth, because the steel isn't going to cost you much. The air that is inside those extra empty spaces is going to cost you nothing. Of course, it's trite. But if you enter a program understanding that things are seriously going to change in the life of the platform, and you build in the capacity for adaptation in all its forms, increasing crew sizes to cope with new missions, to cope with new equipment, for which there is new equipment, then you'll be better placed than if you go into a ship which is chock-a-block full at the beginning of its life with nowhere to go. And perhaps we've all been guilty of that. We certainly have in Australia. So there's an approach. Another approach that industrially that I touched on yesterday, I think, or the day before, whenever that was, is look at everything that looks like it might be a sacred cow. 30-year lives. That's a challenge. Things are going to change in the 30-year life of any ship. In a program of 12 ships delivered every 18 months, that's a very, very long program. Don't keep them for 30 years. Of course, every one of these proposals has its flip side, its downside, and you've got to keep that in mind too. The notion of continuous shipbuilding, for example, has great benefits, but it also has significant downsides. Not least amongst those is if you have a relatively stable capital acquisition funding line, then what you're actually doing is reducing flexibility in the capital funding by tying up a portion of it forevermore. And while we in the Navy think that's a great idea because it achieves a continuous shipbuilding program, for those who suffer repeated block obsolescence in large dollar numbers, i.e. air forces, they don't think that's very good at all. And for those organisations that fill up the little gaps between the big spikes and the now locked up forevermore, the Army, they don't like it much either, because the little bits that are left over for them, generally they're smaller numbers, not always, but generally, it makes their life more difficult too. So, I mean, do an appreciation process of where all of the dimensions of the problem lie, and see where the innovation space is possible. And one of those is an article that someone sent me only yesterday, which is, I haven't read the article yet, but the abstract is an interesting one, and it's an article which compares the US Navy's Virginia program with the US Navy's San Antonio program, and the central hypothesis seems to be that you can set price as the one fixed element of a program, and everything else is variable. And in fact, if you look at it carefully, that's what Virginia was. It became a fixed price because the CNO said to EB, I can't give you 2 submarines a year if you don't get the price down below $2 billion US in, I think it was 2003 dollars. And so they went through a massive cost extraction program to achieve that, and they did. So it was fixing cost, not a fixed price contract, but fixing cost and focusing the industry on removing costs while still achieving as much of the outcome as they could get to. So I don't know what ships in 20 years are going to look like. They'll be there for sure. They may look similar to today. They may have entered service with lots and lots of open space, and I hope so.
Commander Paul Grimshaw of the Navy staff. Dr. Boutilier, I'd like to thank you very much for the feast that you've laid before us over these past 3 days. And just to briefly summarize my takeaways, the first day seemed to be a presentation of a number of national views on what maritime security meant. And that led to the second day, where the focus was really about the system of maritime trade and how that system really affects the maritime commons. But there was a takeaway that I got from that, and it coincided with an article that was published in the BBC News about a week ago by a noted academic and journalist that raised the question, will mayors someday rule the world? So as we look for, the middling view between state interests and national doctrine and the protection of the maritime commons, I would ask the panel's views on what are the roles of mayors in these sorts of discussions, and are we missing that valuable component that somehow fits neatly between national positions and histories and doctrine and the more practical aspects of why we are trying to ensure that the seas remain safe, secure, and free.
Paul, could you kindly just restate that quickly, because I think some of my panelists didn't quite catch one or two of the words that you used.
I would be very interested in the panel's views on the potential role that mayors of the major cities, whose locations are the terminus points for the maritime system of trade, and what role they should play in the broader discussion on maritime security issues. Mayors
of cities. The point that was raised is, are the principal authorities in major ports that are the termini for oceanic trade, should they in fact play any part in terms of the discussion of how their ports and the maritime context develops?
I'm inclined to say yes and then hand the microphone over to my colleagues. I think in a sense, that is the obvious answer, actually, and it's probably also a true one, not least in the importance of taking publics with you in developments that could well be environmentally sensitive. We heard yesterday the argument made by some of the economists in the first panel about the need to expand port facilities in many places around the world, and that this typically takes place in areas that are environmentally sensitive and socially sensitive, of course, as well, for all of these sorts of reasons. So domestic political considerations like this are extremely important. I'd extend the answer a little bit to say that we should never forget the importance of domestic players and stakeholders in defining all aspects of a maritime approach anyway. Oh yeah. One of the issues that came out in the discussions about the South China Sea, for example, was the importance, the economic and social importance of the fishing communities. That's another example where local authorities have a right, have in fact a duty to get involved in the processes of deciding what the maritime strategy of their nation should be. So just to go back to where I started, I think the answer to your question is yes.
Alex Butterfield, U.S. Pacific Command. More of a quick comment, actually, but I'd like to invite the panel's commentary on my comment. In the United States, we're fond these days of talking about whole-of-government approaches to problems. Our own rebalance to Asia is supposed to be a whole-of-government enterprise with information, intellectual capital, commerce, energy, in addition to the military. But at the end of the day, the rebalance is counted in numbers of planes and ships and bases. Likewise, President Obama would like a whole-of-government approach to the South China Sea issue. And yet every time our National Security Council meets, they default to a military option. More planes, more patrols, more bases, more forward presence. It seems to me that one of the often neglected components of sea power is the power of navies to influence their central governments. It seems to me that we, who know the sea and know sea power, have an obligation to explain to our central governments the limits of sea power in solving complex multinational problems. Now, I've been to conferences like this. They're put on by and for people who already understand sea power. How do we better our central governments? How do we fill the chairs that are reserved up front with national security advisors and others rather than 3 stars and 4 stars who already understand.
You'd like to field that, Admiral?
I fully agree with your comments that a whole of government approach is required and things should not be relegated only to the military option. Here, since you're from the United States, I'd say that there is some amount of work that the United States does in respect of soft power, but somehow I think it's relegated to a distant second or maybe fifth on the list. There's much more that the US can do in terms of soft power, because we've seen that nations which have used these means, they're able to actually influence the environment in a very major way without having to resort to just military presence.
Hasjim, perhaps you might like to. How do we educate, inform, direct, encourage national authorities in terms of awareness of how does the Navy and the naval community inform the key decision makers in a state like Indonesia as to the importance of naval power?
Thank you. With reference to the South China Sea, I have always argued a couple of points, which I mentioned also the other day. My last suggestions on that one is there should be some role for the chairman of ASEAN to encourage, not to solve, but to encourage discussion, hopefully reaching to solution between the claimants parties. Now, I notice in ASEAN, there are 2 groups there, or 2 components. There are 4 claimants to some of the South China Sea part: Vietnam, Philippines, Malaysia, Brunei. And there are 6 non-claimants at all, like Myanmar, Thailand, Cambodia, Laos, Singapore, and Indonesia to some extent also there. And there are other non-ASEAN claimants. In this particular case, is China, and we call Chinese Taipei. Now, I always like to take the examples of how we solve the problems of the Cambodian question before. By invoking informal meeting of all these countries to sit down together. That's what we call Jakarta informal meeting, for instance. Or, to put it rather sarcastically, informal cocktail parties, encouraging talk between the parties while others are supporting that and giving all kinds of assistance that may help the kind of solutions. In the end, solve the Cambodian questions. Even after what we know, China teach Vietnam a lessons and something like that. Now, I have been suggesting this. When Indonesia was chairman of ASEAN, we mentioned that. When Cambodia was the chairman, I was in Cambodia. And when Brunei was chairman, I was in Brunei also. And when Myanmar is now a chairman, I was in Myanmar a couple of weeks ago. Talking about encouraging them, not solving the problem because we are not party, but encouraging them to talk and find out a solution. This is a diplomatic effort that will require time, patience, tenacity, seriousness, and so forth. Myanmar has not done it, or perhaps has done it quietly. And I'm sure that I was telling that in Myanmar, you have at least 4 or 5 positive points on this. One, you are not there. You are not a claimant to the South China Sea. 2, you are good relation with China. 3, you are now on the upstart of your own good names in the area. And 4, if you don't do it, then the next chairman of ASEAN may be the involved parties that may be difficult for them to take that initiative, like Malaysia, Philippines, Vietnam, and so forth. So I think they try to do that a little bit, but very, very slowly and diplomatically. Now, my point is that on the South China Sea issue, there are rooms for diplomatic, informal process to move on. There are other rooms, like go to the court, like using force, or like increasing military powers. But I'm not following that route. I'm following the route of a rather quiet, informal, diplomatic process, bringing the parties together and sit down and see what we can achieve with that one. Thank you. Sorry.
You're a veteran, Jeff, of the naval wars in Whitehall. How would you respond to Alex's question?
Yes, it's a difficult one. The question actually specifically focused on how do navies get the message across to governments that there are limits to what they can do. The bureaucratic problem with doing that is that if you provide information to your political masters and your paymasters that there are things that you cannot do, you might be imperiling your budget. So that's not what Navy should do. It seems to me that Navy should emphasize the positive rather than the negative. What their role is in providing that degree of reassurance that's part and parcel of the process of this kind of notion of cooperative deterrence that we've been playing around with. It seems to me that the argument forcefully made that the requirement is for presence, the requirement is for continuous engagement, and this has 2 functions. Function number 1 is to reassure possible adversaries and allies and partners that nothing malign is intended, by the kind of thing that the ambassador has just been talking about, by constant attendance at sessions like this, by staff exchanges, by exercises, and all the rest of it with all of the other maritime stakeholders in a particular region. And secondly, positive contribution to multinational, multi-naval campaigns for maritime security against piracy, drug smugglers, illegal fishing, whatever the case may be. But if you don't have forward presence, if you don't have familiarity with the region, if you don't have the capacity for continuous engagement, you can't do any of these things. And this, it seems to me, is the argument that navies ought to be putting over, rather than simply saying, don't expect us to solve all your problems. Because I think that's kind of simplistic, but it's also possibly dangerous.
Rowan, you want to?
Just very briefly, if I may, and at risk of again appearing trite, there is a nation in this room of whom an experienced civil servant remarked to me, what you don't seem to understand is that the Navy's foreign policy quite frequently differs from the government's foreign policy. Now, the reason I relate that story is because I think the key issue at the heart of your question is a matter of trust. And building trust with a government or with politicians very broadly, whether they be in government or in opposition, is something which is a daily exercise in struggle. It's not a struggle that can be avoided. You have to engage in the struggle every day. Every opportunity you get to speak to a politician, you have to use the opportunity to build trust. And if you've got a foreign policy in your Navy which differs from your government, you're not going to do that. it's hard work. It is hard work. But you've got to have a clear, concise, simple, straightforward, readily understandable mission statement that they can get. It's different for your country from mine. Yours is a nation which, as has been the United Kingdom, that has an almost intuitive comprehension of the importance of sea power. Mine doesn't. And the struggle is harder in those circumstances.
Alan?
Thank
Please.
you. Excuse me. Alan Breakspear. One quick comment and one short question. The comment is that one of the several takeaways for me from this conference has been highlighted in the previous discussion of this panel, and that is, and I suggest it might be a topic for addressing in a future conference, and that is the role of the Navy in the exercise and deployment, if you like, of soft power. I think that's been extremely important and fairly well developed, but might deserve more attention. The question is based on an observation, a lament rather than a criticism. The agenda for this conference has not looked at the Russian Navy. My question for the panel is, does that lacuna matter?
Russian Navy, yes, but I thought the subject of the the discussion of MSC was Asia Pacific, and somehow the Western Pacific is a bit away from here. I'd say that the players at this point of time are the ones which have been discussed over the past few days, and to the best of my knowledge, Russian Navy has not played a prominent role in the events as they're unfolding in South China Sea. Elsewhere, perhaps, they would be involved in use of naval forces. But as I see that, perhaps they don't see a role for themselves at this stage in South China Sea.
Well, I should mention parenthetically that the planning for this conference extended over 18 or 20 months. And in the initial stages, we thought actively about a panel which engaged Russia. But of course, as you can fully appreciate, in the interval, the international scene changed unexpectedly, and that made our calculus somewhat more complex. What's important, I think, and serendipitous in this circumstance is that immediately behind our next questioner is our colleague from Paris, who has a superb poster outside in the Palm Court on the contemporary state of the Russian Navy. So Alexandra can perhaps add a further gloss on the question that Alan put. But first, Lee Cordner, please.
Yes, good morning, panellists, and thank you for doing such an excellent job of bringing this all together for us. Lee Cordner from University of Adelaide, Australia. I particularly liked the title of this conference, the overarching title, Maritime Security Challenges. And I found the fact that we spent quite a bit of time talking about what should navies do, completely understandable, but actually it's a subset, isn't it, of that bigger title that we're aiming at. And similarly, the debates about traditional versus non-traditional maritime security, I would also suggest a somewhat spacious discussion, although it's being had all around the world right now. So I guess my proposition is that if we think about the whole issue in terms of the ends we seek and then the means that might be available to achieve those ends, like the ends-means equation, where in very simple terms or broad terms, the ends we collectively seek is comprehensive maritime security with all its bits and pieces, sovereignty, freedom of trade, economic and environmental issues, and a shared problem that we have certainly in much of the Asia-Pacific and Indian Ocean of a lack of capacity to be able to deal with those comprehensive maritime security challenges. So, and we have shared risks and common vulnerabilities within that. So I would ask the panel if you could comment upon how do you see the means of developing and improving our cooperative and collective approaches to deal with these common and shared risks and vulnerabilities to our comprehensive maritime security. Because I think within that discussion lies many of the bits and pieces about traditional, non-traditional navies, what should navies do or not do, etc. I know that's a fairly big area, but I'd be grateful for your responses on that broad question. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. That was a very good question. This notion of comprehensive maritime security is a useful one, because it is a reminder that security is a whole, that it can be threatened from all sorts of different angles. Interstate war, I argued earlier, was probably the most serious threat to maritime security, but far from being the only one. If one looks, for example, at something like illegal drug smuggling or people smuggling, you can see the threats at two different levels. The first is direct and human. It's to the individual sufferers of those two trades. The second is its propensity to lead to areas of instability where those problems can't be managed properly. And one thinks of areas of northern Mexico, worrying trends in West Africa, and so on and so forth. So you simply can't divide the security challenges into two two clear-cut traditional, non-traditional categories. It's not like that. They're both parts of a single whole. And I think if you look at the seriousness of some of these, using the word again, non-traditional challenges, what one is reminded of very forcibly is the fact that we are struggling with a problem of shortage, that our capacity to deal with these rising threats, and both of those are getting worse, not better, suggests that we have to pay much more attention on making sure that our maritime security operations are intelligence-led. Because if they're not intelligence-led, they're much less likely to be cost-effective or even effective. And so that goes back to this sort of grand issue of maritime domain awareness, about the exchange of information, about possibly more ambitiously, the exchange of intelligence between navies and coast guards and all the other agencies that are necessarily involved in dealing with threats of that sort. So if I was asked for a single recommendation on what we collectively, navies, coast guards, maritime, marine police forces, and all the rest of it, should focus on, it would be in the area of exchanging information and looking at ways of moving on to the much more ambitious and much more useful notion of exchanging intelligence about people like pirates, drug smugglers, and so on and so forth. We all know that's difficult because it runs across standard operating procedures in individual countries. There are concerns about the sources of that intelligence, the processes of that intelligence, how you gain it. Do you necessarily want everybody to know all those sorts of things? But it does seem to me, bearing in mind the widening gap between the units that you can use in order to get maritime security and the challenges that the bad guys like drug smugglers are increasingly posing to maritime security, that's the way we have to go.
Alexandra?
Well, thank you, Jim. So I start with my comment on the Russian Navy, and then I put my question.
Please.
So on the Russian Navy, I could start my comment by putting a question to the audience and asking, have you read the Russian naval doctrine of 2001? Who in this room has read the Russian naval doctrine of 2001? So I think that the main issue is ignorance about Russia. They were down, so we no longer paid attention to them. And indeed, they were down, and we see that their navy has decreased in number. Maybe it's 20 times less powerful in number of operational units than it was at the end of the Cold War. But the Russians, and if you read the 2001 naval doctrine, which follows on the 2000 military doctrine, and then there was another military doctrine in 2009, and this doctrine is of interest because it's based on the dissertation of the then commander-in-chief of the Russian Navy, and Putin attended personally the dissertation of the commander-in-chief of his navy. I don't know in the world if you have many political leaders who would attend the dissertation of the commander-in-chief of the navy. So if you look at this document, it's very clearly stated that their biggest fear is the fact that their capabilities are going down and that the West is not paying attention to their core interest. And the basic core interest for them was the expansion of NATO that they still see as a threat to them. Of course, they are paranoid because obviously we don't have any ill intentions toward them, but this extension across the borders of the former Soviet Union. I'm not talking about the Baltic states, obviously. So this is their perception. And obviously, they were very humiliated in 1999 when they saw that we bombed Kosovo for reasons which were perfectly logical in the context, but they saw that as something that would not have happened in their days. And they felt that we were not paying attention to their security concerns. And we've seen that more recently with the 2008 situation in Georgia, and obviously more recently with the Ukraine crisis. So in this general context, the Russian Navy, because it has lost, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, part of its logic because of the implosion, has tried to rebuild itself and to rebuild a military-industrial complex based in Russia, but they are still dependent on Ukraine and for a long time for the gas turbines, for instance, in the Zarya company. But they have lost so much in terms of intellectual capabilities, of R&D, that their programs have been extremely slow. And we see that if we look at the nuclear attack submarine, we only have one unit of a new class in 21 years, just one unit. If we look at the surface ships, they are just painfully now starting to build a new class of frigate for them, but 20 years after the end of the Cold War. So they are just trying to replace their obsolete force. It's largely obsolete. They see as the main threat NATO, the United States, not paying attention to their interest, and therefore they want to be able to deter an intervention or something in what they call their near abroad, and obviously the other nations, former Soviet republics, don't like that notion of near abroad. And they believe that we try to push, to roll back, that's their perceptions. So I think that in the future, the Russian Navy will continue to decline, because if you look at the age of their fleet, the surface fleet, 25 years of age, most of the ships, 30 years of age. And therefore, the numbers will continue to decline. They have restored a certain capability to build ships, because they are now building ships. But they won't have the capabilities to confront us or to return to the situation that we had seen at the end of the Cold War, where they represented a real threat at that time, yes. So, frankly, I think it's a very different situation that we see now than a return of Russia as being willing to confront us. I don't think they have the means, I don't think that they have the economics to confront us. So this is what I have to say about the Russian Navy.
Thank you so much for that comprehensive footnote, I think extremely valuable to everyone in this room. And you had a question you wanted to pose.
So my question was for Ambassador Djalal on the South China Sea. The Code of Conduct of 2002 was criticized, I think it was yesterday or the day before yesterday. In my naive understanding, I still see it as a kind of a guarantee that the things are not going out of control. But my question would be to Ambassador to understand his perception, his analysis of the Chinese position in this conflict. You know, my candid understanding, and I mean our Chinese friends have convinced me that they were unwilling to go to war in the South China Sea, and that they prefer the peaceful solution, but that I think they are prisoners of their own claims. You know, they cannot lose face. They cannot do less than what the Kuomintang left them, because this claim is a claim from the time of Chiang Kai-shek. You know, they cannot do less. So how can they exit this situation? So their proposal was the famous motto by Deng Xiaoping, but obviously exploit gently and leave the sovereignty issues for the future. Obviously, this is not acceptable to the other parties. So with your wisdom, Ambassador, first of all, what is your understanding of the Chinese position? And then what would be the solution, if you can see one?
Sorry, I'm beginning to be confused with the questions. Well, the way I was informed, what are the Chinese view on the code of conduct? If that is the questions, first, reluctant. Second, willing to talk. Third, not in a hurry. And I think in this process, we have to move along that kind of perimeter. I think slowly we move on. That's what I said the other day. Slowly, hopefully, it could be expedited. And that's what we hope. And I think there is a question of testing patience here. And with all my due respect to my colleague Hong Nong over there, my understanding is that the Chinese had a lot of experience with regard to patience. Now, I keep saying, and I said that not only here, I said everywhere, the Chinese proverb saying that the 1,000 miles start with the first step. But I have always been telling my friend from China all the time, can you make your first step a little bit bigger? No, the reaction, of course, not very responsive to that too. But I have the feeling that it can be done.
Great.
Thank you.
Admiral?
I don't have a comment on the specific question that was put, but in terms of the question put to the audience about having read, the Russian doctrine, which was brought out in 2001, in the Financial Times more recently had talked about an article by General Valery Gerasimov, Chief of General Staff of Russian Armed Forces, in February 2013, which talked about blurring of lines between war and peace. It sounded very interesting from the FT article, so I got a translation of it from my naval attaché Moscow, and I'll just read one paragraph which perhaps may invite your curiosity to it. This is in the background of Arab Spring and similar events taking place. He says, the rules of war have changed significantly. The role of non-military methods to achieve political and strategic objectives have in many cases far exceeded the effectiveness than just the use of force of arms.
Yes, Thorsten Bochentin from Germany. One of the key phrases of his has been tyranny of distance, and it has been viewed as a challenge, especially for us in the Western world, in getting where it is at. But on the flip side, this is also an opportunity for those who are already there. That is, the tyranny of distance experienced by us Westerners is the chance to convert host nation capabilities and the opportunity to offer basing capacity into strategic coin for the countries which are in the region. One good example of this is, of course, the LCS stationing in Singapore. And the question for our good ambassador is, in what way does he see those kinds of opportunities also for Indonesia? And for Dr. Till, in what way could we, as the, you could say, smaller Western nations, do about a multilateral approach, I think, to achieving basing relationships with countries which are already there, not just in the South China Sea, but actually all over the world.
Could I begin, Jeff, with you? Would you be kind enough to? And of course, the allusion is to the famous passage by Geoffrey Blaney from Australia, that Australians suffered from the tyranny of distance. And this is certainly a critical element in terms of naval planning in an ocean as vast as the Pacific. Jeff.
I think the starting point has to be to reiterate the point that forward presence is of huge advantage in sustaining continuous engagement, the ability to monitor what's going on, to get involved in what's going on in all parts, crucial parts of the world as far as all nations is concerned. I think that's the starting point. One way of dealing with the tyranny of distance is, as you mentioned, to look at ways in which that forward deployment can be supported in those areas of concern. And traditionally, and Mahan talks about it a great deal, one way of doing that is trying to build bases in those areas. But I think what we've seen over the last few decades has been increasing sensitivity about foreign bases in your country. And so what we're increasingly seeing is the creation of arrangements, of facilities, of places, not bases, as they say, as a way of trying to square the circle of maintaining a forward presence without violating local sensitivities. And that does seem to me to be the way to go, because these kinds of arrangements are consensual. They are the kind of arrangements that can only work with the support of local states. And it might well be, in the case of the Singapore example that you mentioned, that Singapore may well have made the calculation that its relative welcome for the presence of 4 littoral combat ships operating in that area and using facilities in Singapore would be acceptable and would not be regarded as too provocative by its neighbours, simply by virtue of the fact that it wasn't a base. And it seems to me that that kind of sensitivity is the way of dealing with this sort of problem of the tyranny of distance. You asked specifically my colleague, the ambassador, for a sort of Indonesian view on this, and perhaps I could ask him to provide it. Do you have any views on Singapore and LCS?
Well, I don't know what to say anymore. Yeah? I've said too much already. First of all, with regard to SARIA, which I understand is search and rescue operation, we talk a lot about this issue in the South China Sea workshop within the context of safety of navigation, shipping, and communication. And after so many discussions, we agreed at the time to ask Malaysia to initiate a serious program on this. But up to now, Malaysia has not yet come up with a specific program how to implement and promote SAR activities in the South China Sea area. We are still sort of in the process of doing that, you know. Well, with Singapore, we always have a very straight kind of discussion all the time. There is one thing that have not gone very smoothly, that Singapore like to do some possibility of military exercise in Indonesian waters. in the area between Kalimantan and Singapore. That has not been very popular in Indonesia. Especially the program that they were submitting at that time was giving Singapore the right or the possibility to invite third parties in that kind of military exercise. That's not something popular in Indonesia. And therefore, my understanding is that on that particular issue of military exercises between the South China Sea and Indonesian waters, but inside Indonesian waters, I don't think the government is willing to submit that to Parliament, because they know that the Parliament will not necessarily endorse it. So that's the situation at this moment. Other than that, I think the relation is very good. As I said, we have been cooperating in the Strait of Malacca and Singapore for more than 40 years now, since 1971. We have written 3 territorial sea boundary agreements in the Singapore Strait to make it easy for law enforcement. The last one was only a few weeks ago. And I think this is something good between the two countries. And we did also write agreement on the joint patrol and joint something like that, you know. That is why I keep saying that writing boundary agreement between neighbors is always essential. Now, I can tell you that not all my friends in Southeast Asia agree with me on that one, because we don't quite know sometimes what kind of boundary agreement we talk about. There are so many boundary agreements that we should deal with. We have not written any agreement, for instance, on contiguous zone yet. We have difficulty in writing agreement on economic zone. But we have less difficulty in writing agreement on continental shelf. We have 3 with India, I remember, agreement on continental shelf. So we are trying to do that. And perhaps it's not being asked, but I just mentioned, Indonesia has written 21 agreements now with its neighbors on maritime boundaries. Not easy to find out those countries in Southeast Asia who had already so many boundary agreements with its neighbors, just in order to avoid potential conflicts, to make it easy for law enforcement. So I guess that is my general answer to that. Thank you.
So I think, ladies and gentlemen, that what this conference has revealed is the enormous complexity of the Indo-Pacific region. That in a region which is increasingly problematic and brittle at sea, the ambassador's closing comments highlight the positive achievements that can be effected in the region, and those should be hallmarks for us in terms of moving forward. So please join me again in a round of applause for our panelists. Thank you so much.